Hello. In the last couple of lectures, we've been setting the stage, as it were, for our historical drama by looking at various natural environments and also by taking a close-up look at some of Africa's great places. It's time now to ring the bell on the main event, and today I want to dive in to the human history of Africa in the truly long run. This is indeed the longest human history of all. I say that because the overwhelming balance of evidence shows that humanity, in the broadest sense, originated in Africa. That Africa was the birthplace, the cradle of humankind. That the rest of the world was populated literally out of Africa. Now, of course, statements of the sort I just made beg the question: what is it that makes humans human? At one level, I suppose, this is really a question of philosophy and indeed of religion, and discussions of soul and the meaning of life and so forth certainly are relevant. I'm not going to delve into that. At the physical level, different people might emphasize different characteristics which they think are typical of humanity and separate us from other animals. These might include bipedalism, that is, standing upright on 2 feet, moving on those 2 feet, walking and running, as opposed to 4 like many of the higher mammals. It might include an enlarged brain capacity, particularly in relation to body size. It might include language, communicating through the interchangeable use of the phonemes, the sounds that humans are capable of making and constructing meaning in that way. It almost certainly would include the regular making, the manufacture, and use of tools. And by tools, I simply mean an extension of the human body utilized to perform work, to perform a task. Other animals like chimpanzees and even some others will make use of a stick or a rolled leaf or what have you, but they don't regularly manufacture, store, reuse the tools in order to perform those tasks. So evolutionary theory then, as applied to humans, in this case humans emerging in Africa, really means the gradual development of the whole cluster, the whole package, if you like, culminating in our species, in Homo sapiens sapiens. Now, 2 basic kinds of evidence demonstrate that Africa is the cradle of humankind. The more recent kind of evidence, and it's so recent that it's actually missing, it's completely absent in a number of textbooks still quite widely used, standard sorts of textbooks for courses in Africa. This form of evidence is based on the mapping, if you like, of human descent by tracing the inheritance of mitochondrial DNA, the substance that's inside each cell of each of us. Now, I say mapping, in a sense, what the experts using, obviously, not only DNA samples, but this would be impossible without the advent of computers. Another reason, along with the discovery of DNA, which was only 30 or 40 years ago, why it is so new. When I say mapping, in a sense, what they're doing is ascending the lines of human descent. They're working backwards to look at where human populations came from and moved to. Now, thus far, this new and very complex, very exciting form of evidence has confirmed, so far it has only confirmed the the evidence drawn from a very different kind of research, in a sense, an equally difficult sort of research, painstaking, even heroic efforts by paleontologists in Eastern and Southern Africa who have searched for nearly a century now for fossil remains of humans, fossil evidence of human origins. In the 1920s, the South African paleontologist Raymond Dart discovered the remains of a creature that he called Australopithecus. The creature was about the size of an 8-year-old boy, had a brain capacity of probably 450 cubic centimeters, roughly a third of a modern Homo sapiens sapiens, modern human brain capacity. But it was sufficiently human-like, that is, walking upright on 2 legs, although with a pronounced forward stoop, and different from other extinct or modern higher primates, to be considered the start of the so-called hominid line of evolution. Now, at this point, I might clarify something which might be old hat to many of my listeners or viewers, but a confusion that I frankly encounter fairly often among my undergraduates. People will often speak of evolution as a reference to humans descended from apes, and what they have in mind is modern apes, orangutans, gorillas, monkeys of various species, and so forth. Not quite. What evolutionary theory applied to Africa suggests is not that Homo sapiens, that humans are descended from modern apes, but rather that modern apes and humans, modern apes and members of the hominid line leading to modern humans, share common ancestry. That at a certain point, a line of evolution broke off and culminated in the emergence of humankind. Now, Dart's work was followed by many who followed in his path. Beginning in the 1930s, the tireless efforts of the Leakeys, Lewis and Mary Leakey, operating in East Africa, Kenya and Tanzania predominantly, places like Olduvai Gorge in northern Tanzania, which you can visit, by the way, and a place associated with our Great Rift that we met in lectures 2 and 3. Efforts of the Leakeys in the 1930s, followed later by their still quite active son, Richard Leakey, whom I mentioned briefly last time, resulted in numerous discoveries which elaborated variations of Australopithecines in parts of East in parts of East Africa. In the 1970s, Donald Johanson and his team found a famous skeleton in Ethiopia, which they called Lucy. The name actually came from the Beatles song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, which apparently was popular in camp that year. Johanson's discovery of the skeleton of Lucy pushed the hominid origin, this form of Australopithecus, and again, there are variations on the Australopithecus species, back to 3 to 4 million years ago. Meanwhile, other discoveries, also in East Africa, Southern Africa, suggested a somewhat more sophisticated species, Homo habilis, or man, the tool maker, which overlapped or coexisted with Australopithecus, was almost certainly a direct ancestor of modern humans. With the next major stage, Homo erectus, or man the upright, and an obvious reference to full-time bipedalism, as it were. Hominids spread throughout Africa and indeed began to spread into much of the old world by about 1.5 million years ago. But evolution continued in Africa, culminating in Homo sapiens at least 100,000 years ago, and finally in Homo sapiens sapiens, man the wise and man the wiser, if you like. Homo sapiens sapiens perhaps 40,000 years ago. And again, these spread through the world from Africa. John Reeder, whose book I mentioned before, Africa, A Biography of a Continent, sums up the whole picture, in a sense, of the populating of Africa, of the world from Africa, with this rather striking paragraph. He talks about several strands of evidence, including the DNA evidence, the fossil evidence, and so forth. In his words, these, quote, point persuasively to the conclusion that every person alive today is descended from a population of anatomically modern humans that existed only in Africa until 100,000 years ago. They were nomads, and they soon spread around the globe. Within the span of 4,000 generations, modern humans reoccupied the regions where Homo erectus and archaic Homo sapiens had become extinct. They replaced pre-existing populations and colonized lands that people had never occupied before. Listen to his closing. Humans dominate the earth and have been to the moon. We are visions of the future. We see visions of the future in the mind's eye and turn them to reality with the aptitudes and talents which evolution bestowed in Africa. Now, the notion of all of humanity descended from these core migrants out of Africa brings us rather quickly to a concept which is, for obvious reasons, going to figure in a great many of our lectures. And that, of course, is the concept of race. The old theory, of course, about race was what we might call multigenesis, that certain racial types of humans, in essence, evolved, or if you like, were created separately. And what this research, of course, demonstrates is that it's not true. Let me quote Spencer Wells, a young man who's done extraordinary efforts in taking DNA samples, basically by getting swabs from people's mouths all over the world, in an effort to trace much more specifically the steps in these migrations and populating of all the continents. His book, Journey of Man, published by Princeton in 2002, he says that the old-fashioned stereotypes of race are not only socially divisive, but scientifically wrong. We're all from Africa. Now, race I'll say a lot more about in future lectures, but Wells has been struck by how fast migrant populations, originally moving out of Africa, but eventually into the Old World, across the Bering Strait in the New World and so forth, how fast, in relatively few thousand years of time, a population transplanted and then isolated to some extent adapts to a new environment, and that these adaptations show up in physical differentiation. In essence, the origins of what humans, not nature, but humans in various ways, something I'll emphasize later on, categorize or group in some societies into so-called races. Now, from the time of Homo habilis, for again, the progression here basically is Australopithecus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, Homo sapiens sapiens. From the time of Homo habilis, again, man the toolmaker, forward, experts speak of an early, middle, and late Stone Age. Now, the term Stone Age, quite obviously, comes from the principle, let me put it differently, the most durable material from which these early humans or hominids made tools. They made tools out of many things, and I'll read you a passage in a few minutes which will show some of the other substances. But of course, those substances tend to rot. They tend to disintegrate, and the stone tools can be studied. It's for that reason primarily that these terms, late, middle, and early Stone Age, come. The late Stone Age roughly coincides with the appearance of Homo sapiens sapiens. Now, at this point, with modern people, if you like, firmly established in Africa, let's try to characterize life in the very late Stone Age. How were Africans living, let's say, 10,000 years ago? 10,000 BC, 12,000 years ago. What was life like? We can ask a subsidiary question which is very dear to historians, and that question is this: How would we know what their life was like? What would our sources be for that? Now, I'd suggest there are three principal kinds of sources to piece together a portrait of what I'm going to call the long first chapter of human existence. The three sources would be archaeological remains of stone tools, burial sites, etc. Again, related to the work of the paleontologists that we've been talking about. Another form of evidence which is quite ubiquitous in Africa, certainly in many parts of Africa, is what's usually called rock art. And that is paintings that were made by early human inhabitants of, again, various regions of Africa on essentially the sides of cliffs, on the interior walls of caves where they resided, and so forth. In southern Africa, you can get maps of these. You could spend a lifetime doing nothing but visiting these rock art sites. They are very impressive, and not just artistically. They offer you, of course, clues to a way of life, of social organization. In fact, some of them, the real experts, say they offer clues even about religious ideas or what have you. Now, a third type of evidence, and this is the trickiest one perhaps, evidence about the original human inhabitants of Africa and how they lived, is through observation of the few, and I do mean few, remaining communities who live still, or have lived in recent times, in ways characteristic of the late Stone Age. When I say very few, that's what I mean. The Itur pygmies, so-called, of the Congo rainforest, or in the Kalahari desert areas of southwestern Africa, the Khoisan, the San, the so-called Bushman regions there. Again, the fact is that these peoples have been displaced. They have been replaced. They have, in a sense, this is a way of life that's been marginalized by very different ways of life, as we'll see soon enough. Now, to characterize our lifestyle, for lack of a better term, it seems to me there are basic questions you can ask to try to get at, the nature of an age or an epoch or an era, if you like. And I think you can apply them to a lot of ages, the industrial age or the digital age or what have you. Let's ask it about this very late Stone Age. The questions I have in mind are some very basic ones indeed. How did people make a living in the most basic sense? How did they extract a livelihood? How did they ensure the survival of themselves and future generations? What tools did they use to perform the work? How big were the societies, the communities? I know the terminology is a little bit imprecise here, but how big were the human groups that we're talking about in the late Stone Age? How mobile were they? Were they largely sedentary, settled down, or did they move a lot? Was that movement constant, nomadic, or was it cyclical? And finally, a question that I really like to ask about different ages of history. Who did what? We get it at things like division of labor, at roles, at occupational specializations, and so forth. There's a different way to ask that question, who did what, by the way, or who does what. And we can ask all these questions about our own time and our own place. You could phrase it differently and say, who got to do what? Who gets to do what? Or who has to do what? Who must do what? When we ask the question that way, we open up another question. How stratified were the communities we're talking about? How divided into class or caste or strata? How equal or unequal were the communities, the culture, if you like, that we're dealing with? Okay, well, let's try to offer some quick answers to some of these questions about the late Stone Age. At the most fundamental level, and all of you know this intuitively, I think, people extracted their livelihood directly from nature by gathering wild fruits, roots, vegetables, by hunting wild animals, or indeed, some people don't like to be reminded of this, in essence scavenging from the already dead remains of wild animals, either through natural cause or as a result of other predators, most obviously other animals. We're talking about the foraging world, the hunting and gathering world, extracting directly from nature the caloric intake, the nutrition that humans need to survive. Now, the question about what tools we use, in a sense, we've already answered that. Our reference to Stone Age and so forth gives us a good handle on that. Again, I'll read a passage, though, in a few minutes, which will mention a couple of other things and the functions which they were used for. How big were the groups we were talking about? Well, the answer is they were pretty small, you know. We're probably talking about several dozen people at the most. There appears to be a sort of upward limit on the numbers that can be involved in a foraging livelihood, in a foraging economy, if you like, a hunting, gathering lifestyle. Now, don't think of these groups as completely separate or isolated from one another. They certainly had contact. They had exchange, and in some cases exchange of spouses, more bluntly, of women, of wives between them and so forth. But there is a way in which these represented corporate groups, that is, bounded communities, again, compared to what's coming down the pike, very small indeed, probably several dozen. How mobile were they? Well, several factors: the exhaustion of resources in a given area, the need for water, natural calamities, a locust invasion or drought or what have you, human conflicts on occasion, imposed a relatively high degree of mobility on these groups. Probably not in most cases true nomadism, that is constant movement, but rather probably more of a cyclical or seasonal movement in response to the kinds of needs for water and so forth. Now, who did what and how hierarchical? Again, we haven't got a great deal of space here for much occupational specialization. We don't have the numbers to generate that, or the size to talk about much in the way of hierarchy. Small group size meant little hierarchy. It probably meant quite informal authority. You know, the age of kings or monarchs or what have you is down the road a ways. We do see, however, the earliest forms of role specialization. Again, this won't surprise us, with old people doing different things from adults, doing different things from children. And certainly we see this along gender lines as well, with men doing more hunting, women doing more gathering. And again, that's based largely on the rock art evidence, on the observations of contemporary societies. And I mentioned that contemporary studies, for instance, in the Kalahari of Khoisan peoples, and in particular the so-called Kung. Now, I'm not really pronouncing that correctly. If you've seen it spelled, it's exclamation point K-U-N-G. The exclamation points stands for a click sound. And if you've ever heard the Khoisan languages, which, by the way, are in danger of extinction, of passing from the earth, like so many other languages of many parts of the world, you can hear these clicks. The first time you see a movie like The Gods Must Be Crazy, or they made a lot of money out of that one, so they made The Gods Must Be Crazy too. And the first time you hear Khoisan speech, you hear these clicks. Now, back to, I'm going to say Kung, all right, to avoid embarrassment. Observations of the gender division of labor showed that, in fact, gathering, dominated by women, generated something on the order of 2/3 of the total nutrition, the total caloric intake of the groups, as opposed to about 1/3 coming from the men's main activity of hunting. So rather than who's bringing home the bacon, it was perhaps more appropriate who's putting the salad on the table in terms of that responsibility. Small, highly mobile, hunting, gathering communities. This is most of human history in terms of the time scale, not just in Africa, but elsewhere. It's only relatively recently that this begins to change and change dramatically, as we see next time. There's a question that arises when we characterize this old hunting and gathering lifestyle with so few remnants of it remaining. I would put the question this way: were hunting and hunter-gatherers or hunting and gathering communities, were they to be pitied or to be envied? Now, pity may actually be a bit charitable. Are they to be dismissed? Are they to be pitied or to be envied? What I mean by this is this. There's a tendency for peoples of other cultures living very differently, living initially off of agriculture, let alone products of the industrial age, etc., etc. And I include other African peoples living very differently. A tendency on the part of peoples and cultures living very differently to look at hunter-gatherer societies and react with either a kind of dismissal or pity. I mean, consider the Dutch word that was applied to the hunter-gatherers they found in southern Africa, Bushmen. It's a term which seems to imply kind of out there, on the edge, marginalized, left behind. And indeed, the imagery that often emerges is one that would emphasize a kind of, bitter, desperate struggle of humans against nature, a kind of eking out, scratching out an existence in these harsh conditions, having to go out there and dig for the stuff where you can find it, if you can find it, chasing those animals, etc., etc. That might inspire pity or indeed something less charitable. Now, I mention this because the contemporary studies that I mentioned of the Kong, for instance, and these were studied over decades by a team from Harvard University and so forth, yield some rather surprising findings. If you value leisure and creativity, for instance, this culture could sustain that rather easily. Let me illustrate this. The studies deep in the Kalahari by the Harvard team found that on average, adult men and women had to spend about 15 hours a week doing their economic thing, doing the gathering or the hunting. This generated, on average, about 2,140 calories per day, which is plenty for adults to survive. Now, remember, this is in the Kalahari. What was it like in a better watered environment like today's KwaZulu-Natal or something? Does that mean it was not 15 hours, but 10? Et cetera, et cetera. It's one of the problems with contemporary observations is how do we now, we're not only reading it backwards into history, but we're looking at it in a different environment from which it was often practiced. Let me quote Marshall Solins here, an anthropologist who has studied hunter-gatherers in many locations. He says that we are inclined to think of hunters and gatherers as poor because they don't have anything. Perhaps it's better to think of them for that reason as free. And he develops what he considers a sort of philosophy of few possessions. Let me give you the portrait from probably the most knowledgeable person of all of how hunting and gathering societies might have looked, say at the time of about the birth of Christ. This is Raymond Inskeep from South Africa. The combination of food remains, environment, and artifacts reveals the confidence and success with which the hunter and his womenfolk provided for the group. Plant fibers were spun into fine cordage, which could be used as needed for trap lines and bindings, or worked into fine, strong nets for catching and carrying. Wood was used with simple skill for pegs to keep things off the ground in cave or rock shelter, for arrowheads and bows, for digging sticks and tool handles. Reeds were cut for arrow shafts or woven into mats. Time, skill, and taste were brought to the fashioning of beads and pendants and objects of bone, shell, and ivory, at whose use we can only guess. In all, we see evidence of a masterly adaptation to the environment. He goes a bit further. We find evidence of sophisticated and successful populations, employing with confidence a wide range of skills to support themselves in their chosen or inherited territories. For some, there may have been hard times when food was short, but rarely would it fail completely. For others, life must have come close to ideal in terms of security. With 1.5 million years of experience behind him, man had reached the highest points of success in the evolution of the hunting-gathering way of life in southern Africa. Now, Inskeep may wax a bit utopian in that description. After all, even in the contemporary sandals, the average lifespan, for instance, is about 40 years. Nonetheless, for better, for worse, this was a world, it was a way of life in retreat. And we'll see why in the next lecture. A different world, a world based on agriculture and iron, is what we turn to in our next lecture.